The grand chandelier cast its sparkling light across the wedding hall, reflecting off crystal glasses and gilded decorations. Everywhere, laughter and chatter swirled, a symphony of celebration that I felt strangely disconnected from. I had come hoping for a moment of familial warmth, maybe even pride, but instead, I felt like an invisible guest, someone who had wandered into a world that didn't belong to me. My brother, Alexander, was the center of it all. Dressed in a tailored tuxedo that made him look like he had stepped out of a magazine, he moved through the crowd with a signature charm, shaking hands, accepting compliments, his smile effortless and practiced, and there I was, in a modest suit, trying not to notice how everyone's eyes subtly compared me to him. It wasn't supposed to matter. I had my own life, my own accomplishments, but in that room, none of that counted. Alexander's world was built on appearances, on who looked the most successful, the most powerful, the most admired. And according to him, I was none of those things. I had been standing near the table of relatives, exchanging polite nods and small talk when it happened. He came up behind me, whispered in my ear with that infuriating, condescending grin. "You know, it's cute that you think you understand money, but you really are a financial idiot, aren't you?" The words hit me like a physical blow. A murmur of laughter rippled from the nearby guests, some polite, some genuinely amused. My stomach churned, heat rose to my face, but my mouth wouldn't form a reply. I wanted to defend myself, to remind him of my achievements, of the sacrifices I had made to build my career. But the words stuck, lodged somewhere between disbelief and hurt. I felt eyes on me, the silent judgment of cousins and old family friends. Some looked sympathetic, others perhaps curious, as if watching a slow, awkward theater. I wanted to vanish into the polished marble floor. I remembered the countless times growing up when Alexander had belittled me in smaller ways, mocking my choices, my careful savings, my late nights spent analyzing spreadsheets while he chased fleeting trends and applause. I had always brushed it off, telling myself that family dynamics were complicated, that one day he would see me for who I truly was. But tonight that hope shattered like fine china. I retreated to a corner, trying to steady my breathing. The music played on, oblivious to my humiliation. I watched Alexander laugh with his friends, holding his bride's hand as if the world itself owed him admiration. The room seemed to shrink, everyone's joy a cruel backdrop to my private disgrace. And yet, beneath the sting of shame, a quiet, simmering fire began to grow. It wasn't anger in its usual flare. It was something colder, sharper, more deliberate. I would not cry, I would not shout, I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. But I promised myself, right there in the glittering hall, that the story was far from over. I left the wedding early, slipping out under the shadow of the grand archway. The night air hit me, brisk and liberating, carrying away the laughter and the music, leaving only a singular, persistent thought. He had humiliated me publicly, but I would have the last laugh. And when that time came, it would be nothing short of devastating. The days after the wedding passed in a blur, though I felt nothing but clarity. The sting of Alexander's words still lingered, like a bruise that throbbed every time I thought about that hall of glittering chandeliers and polite laughter. But amidst the humiliation, a single thought refused to leave me. If he wanted to see me as weak, as incompetent, as a financial idiot, I would show him just how wrong he had been. It wasn't a reckless desire for revenge. This was patience, strategy. I had always known how to play the long game. While Alexander had the charm, the charisma, the ability to win applause with a smile, I had discipline, foresight, and the kind of intellect that could bend numbers and people to my will. I spent the next weeks quietly observing Alexander's company. From the outside, it looked perfect. Sleek offices, well-dressed employees, quarterly reports that dazzled shareholders. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Poor investment choices, over-leveraged projects, and a lack of strategic discipline created vulnerabilities only an outsider, or a careful insider, could exploit. I had already begun acquiring shares in his company months before the wedding, unnoticed, one small purchase at a time. My modest investments had been dismissed by the market as insignificant, by Alexander as inconsequential. But slowly, deliberately, I increased my stake, masking each move behind anonymous accounts and shell corporations. What I was building was invisible to him, but in a few months it would be unstoppable. I remember sitting in my apartment one evening, staring at the balance sheets and market reports spread across my desk, feeling a thrill that was equal parts excitement and cold satisfaction. My mentor, a retired executive who had taught me everything I knew about corporate strategy, once said, "Revenge tastes sweetest when the target never sees it coming." I had taken that lesson to heart. Alexander's arrogance worked in my favor. He rarely looked behind him, rarely considered that the quiet ones, the ones who worked in shadows, might hold the real power. He believed charm and bravado could carry him through any storm. He underestimated me because he had always done so, because he had never needed to see me as an equal. And yet, there was a part of me that paused in those nights of plotting, reflecting on the cost. Revenge was intoxicating, yes, but it carried weight. This was not a game, this was family, and somewhere deep down, I mourned what had been lost, the brother I had once admired, the childhood memories now tainted by pride and cruelty. But grief would not stop me. It would sharpen me. Every decision I made, every share I acquired, every boardroom maneuver I planned, was part of a carefully constructed path to reclaim my dignity. I wasn't seeking chaos. I was seeking justice, and justice in this case required power. By the end of the month, I had quietly secured enough shares to demand a position on the board. Alexander was dismissive when I made the announcement, smiling that same infuriating smile, assuming this was a minor nuisance, a formality. He did not know that the seat I claimed was the first stone in a carefully laid foundation, one that would eventually crumble beneath his feet. I walked away from that meeting with a sense of calm, almost serenity. For the first time in years, I felt in control. The humiliation of the wedding was no longer a wound, it was fuel. And in the quiet of that victory, I realized something terrifyingly satisfying. The tables were about to turn. And when they did, Alexander would finally see me not as a financial idiot, not as a joke, but as a force he had foolishly ignored. By the time I officially joined the board, Alexander had no idea how much control I already held. He smiled at me during the first meeting, as if my presence were merely a courtesy, a ceremonial nod to family obligation. He leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen between his fingers, confident in the belief that charm and authority were all he needed to succeed. I almost laughed, but I didn't. I had learned long ago that the quiet approach is the deadliest. I listened, I observed, I waited. Every flawed project he initiated, every reckless investment he celebrated as genius, I quietly documented. Every employee loyalty I nurtured, every dissenting voice I encouraged, I noted. Nothing escaped my attention. While he strutted around the office like a king, I built the scaffolding that would hold him accountable. The first subtle shift came almost immediately. I proposed changes in budgeting, minor, uncontroversial adjustments that Alexander barely noticed. Just a formality, he had muttered, flipping through the spreadsheets with a half-interested gaze. But each small tweak tightened my grip, exposing inefficiencies and redirecting resources toward projects only I controlled. Then came the whispers. Employees once loyal to Alexander's charm began seeking me out for advice. I smiled, offered guidance, and slowly became the true strategist behind the company's operations. Alexander noticed, of course, but dismissed it as temporary, a minor shift in dynamics he could easily correct. He underestimated the subtle art of influence. Next, I began to leverage the board itself. Each motion I presented was carefully timed, each vote meticulously secured. By the time Alexander realized the depth of my influence, it was too late. The projects he had boasted about, the deals he had flaunted, began failing, not by chance, but by the strategic moves I had orchestrated from behind the scenes. Cash flows were redirected, partnerships stalled, and the board quietly questioned his judgment. One evening, as he stormed into my office red, faced and furious, I finally let a small smile slip. "You seem stressed," I said, calm and composed, the antithesis of his panic. "I don't understand," he snapped. "How is this happening? Why are these decisions going against me? You called me a financial idiot at your wedding. I replied softly, letting the words hang in the air like a blade. I'm not sure you realized how much that motivated me. His eyes widened, disbelief crossing his features. He looked around the office, suddenly seeing the charts, the reports, the subtly reorganized teams, and for the first time he understood. The control he had taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. The irony was delicious. The brother who had humiliated me in front of dozens now depended on me to stabilize the empire he had always assumed he owned. Every failure, every setback, was a reminder of his arrogance and my patience. I did not need to yell, to humiliate him publicly. My power spoke louder than any words ever could. By the time the quarter ended, it was undeniable. I was the true force behind the company's direction. Alexander's charisma could no longer mask his incompetence. Employees came to me for guidance. Investors began to consult me directly, and the board, quietly aligned with my vision, began making decisions that no longer favored him. And through it all, I remained composed, polite, almost nurturing. I was the shadow he had never seen, the invisible hand that had reshaped his empire, and he had no choice but to follow. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of vindication so sweet. It was almost intoxicating. Alexander's confidence had been a fortress, but I had found the cracks, and now, finally, the walls were crumbling. The moment of final reckoning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. Alexander, once untouchable in his arrogance, now sat across from me in the boardroom, his usual confident smirk replaced by a tense rigidity. The quarterly review had turned into a reckoning he hadn't anticipated. Investors were questioning decisions he had boasted about, partnerships he had flaunted were failing, and employees, those he had once charmed effortlessly, now looked to me for direction. I watched him squirm politely, carefully restraining my satisfaction. There was no need for shouting, no need for confrontation. Power, when wielded correctly, did not need dramatics. It spoke louder than words, and tonight, the truth was undeniable. The empire he had assumed was his by birthright was now firmly in my hands. You seem unsettled, I said, calm, my voice even. I allowed a faint smile, polite but pointed, to linger. Is everything clear now? Alexander's jaw tightened. He glanced at the charts, the reports, the meticulously orchestrated projects on my initiative, and finally, his eyes met mine. For the first time in decades, he saw me not as the younger brother, the quiet one, the one he could dismiss with a cruel joke, but as an equal, a force he had underestimated at his peril. How did you?" he began, then stopped. Words failed him. He had prided himself on intuition, on charm, on the ability to read people, but he had never imagined I would play a game so quietly, so thoroughly, that he would not even notice until it was too late. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. "Do you remember your wedding day?" I asked softly. "Do you remember what you called me in front of everyone?" He flinched, a subtle twitch betraying the memory he had long hoped to bury. I didn't need to repeat the insult. The memory alone was enough to let him feel the weight of what he had done. "Financial idiot," I said, letting the phrase hang in the air like a verdict. "You laughed, I didn't, and I've spent every day since ensuring that what you thought was my weakness became my greatest strength." Alexander's face drained of color. The tables had turned so completely, so utterly, that he could barely comprehend it. The empire he had relied on, the influence he had flaunted, was now quietly but firmly under my control. And every decision he had made without foresight, every arrogance, fueled mistake, had played into my hands. The boardroom fell silent. The employees and executives who had once deferred to him now looked at me with respect, some even with admiration. Alexander realized he was not just losing authority. He was witnessing a complete inversion of power. As I rose to leave, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Revenge, I realized, was not in the destruction of a person, but in the demonstration of one's own growth and mastery. I had not humiliated him with cruelty. I had done it with precision, patience, and undeniable competence. Walking out of the boardroom, I felt a bittersweet satisfaction. Alexander would forever remember today, the day his arrogance met its match. And I, too, would remember how far I had come, and how much it had cost emotionally to reach this moment. Family ties were fractured, but respect had been earned. Later, alone in my office, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. Revenge had been sweet, yes, but the lingering ache of betrayal reminded me that some wounds never fully heal. I had triumphed, yes, but the brother I had once loved, the connection I had hoped to preserve, was irreparably altered. And yet, in that quiet space, I felt the undeniable truth. I was no longer the financial idiot. I was the architect of my destiny, the master of my revenge, and the one who finally held the power that had been denied to me for too long. The tables had turned, and in that turn, I had claimed my victory.